Some secrets are not buried in earth, but beneath the weight of pride. Our tale begins with a battered deerstalker hat found upon a lonely country road in Kent, its stained fabric whispering of blood and betrayal. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, step closer to the fire, for the game is afoot, and we shall follow Holmes into the shadows of a house where honour proved more fatal than crime itself. It was upon one of those raw evenings of December, when the fog drifted in yellow banks along Baker Street, that I found myself once more in the familiar armchair opposite my singular companion. Holmes lay extended upon the sofa, his long fingers steepled together, his hawk-like profile sharply outlined against the firelight. He had that air of abstraction which suggested to me that his mind was busy in regions far removed from our comfortable sitting room. I, meanwhile, allowed my thoughts to wander idly over the curious associations which the world had long attached to his person. Chief among them, strangely enough, was the deerstalker hat. Though in truth, my friend rarely wore it save upon country expeditions, the public imagination had fastened upon this headpiece as the very emblem of the detective. Newspapers and satirical sketches alike had reproduced its peaked crown and ear flaps until the figure of Sherlock Holmes seemed incomplete without it. As I sat watching the coals fall into a red cavern of heat, I mused upon how odd it was that so trivial an article of attire should have come to symbolize one of the keenest intellects of our age. Holmes stirred, glancing at the clock upon the mantelpiece, when suddenly there came a knock at the door, sharp, hurried, and altogether at variance with the quiet rhythm of the evening. I confess that my nerves, attuned to London's countless dangers, gave a slight start at the sound. Holmes, however, raised his brows with the faintest glimmer of interest. "Pray attend to our visitor, Watson," said he, in that cool tone which never failed to steady me. "Few indeed come at such an hour without reason of wait." Mrs. Hudson's step was heard, followed by the creak of the outer door and the murmur of voices upon the stair. Presently, the door opened, and our landlady up languidly from the sofa and motioned her to a chair. His eyes, however, had already fastened upon the package with an eagerness which belied his indifference of manner. "You bring us something of interest, madam," said he quietly. "Permit me to relieve you of it." She hesitated an instant, then placed the parcel in his outstretched hand. He tore the paper away with a swift movement, and there lay disclosed a battered deerstalker hat, frayed at the edges, stained in places, and of no particular distinction, save that, in its very shabbiness, it seemed somehow to possess a history. Holmes turned the hat over in his long fingers, examining it as though it were some rare fossil newly unearthed. His eyes glittered with the light of inquiry, while his thin lips curved in the faintest suggestion of satisfaction. "It is of excellent quality, Watson," he remarked, "though much the worse for wear. Observe the material, fine tweed, such as is seldom chosen by the working man. Yet note how the brim is stained with damp, the lining frayed, and here, see you, a faint indentation where the crown has been habitually grasped." I leaned forward, marvelling as always at the minuteness of his scrutiny. He sniffed at the fabric, brushed away a speck of mud, and ran his fingers along the interior stitching. "Curious, very curious," he murmured, half to himself. "The story is written plainly for those who can read it. One need only the patience to observe." Our visitor sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed upon Holmes with a mixture of dread and hope, as though each word he uttered drew her nearer to some revelation she both longed for and feared. Holmes set the hat upon the table and addressed us with the air of a lecturer unfolding a demonstration. "The owner of this hat, madam, is a gentleman of means, though not of recent prosperity. His purse has grown leaner in the last year, as is evidenced by the shabby condition of a once costly article. He is studious, for the grease upon the inner band bespeaks long hours bent over books or briefs. He has recently endured some agitation of spirit, since this tear in the lining could only have been made by restless fingers plucking at it. He smokes. Ah, yes, a rare tobacco, of the eastern variety, whose ash lingers faintly here. And lastly, he is not young. The sweat stains tell their tale with unfailing accuracy. I could not restrain an exclamation of admiration, while our visitor gasped and half rose from her chair. You have spoken the truth, sir," she whispered, her face pale as marble. Holmes inclined his head gravely, as though the matter were the merest trifle. The lady clasped her hands tightly together. "Mr. Holmes," she faltered, "you do not know how truly you have spoken. That hat was found beneath dreadful circumstances. Circumstances which compel me to seek your aid, for I fear that behind this humble relic lies the shadow of a terrible crime." Our visitor, once steadied, removed her gloves and veil, revealing a countenance more intelligent than comely, though care and anxiety had set their unmistakable seal upon it. Miss Clara Fenwick, for such she gave her name, carried herself with the quiet dignity of one accustomed to duty. Yet beneath that composure, I detected the tremor of nerves strained to their utmost. Her dark eyes moved restlessly between Holmes and myself, as though to measure how far her tale might find credence. Holmes, with his habitual courtesy, indicated a chair close to the fire. "You have placed before us a most singular object," said he, with a glance at the Deerstalker upon the table. "Pray, enlighten us as to its history." At this invitation, Miss Fenwick clasped her hands tightly, as though to summon courage, and leaned forward with the air of one who bore upon her shoulders a grievous burden. "It was 3 nights past," she began, her voice low yet resolute, "when the village constable brought word that a lady apprehension." Miss Fenwick's voice grew firmer as she proceeded, as though the very act of confession lent her strength. "Edward Armitage, sir, is the only son of Sir George Armitage of Armitage Court. A barrister by profession, he had already distinguished himself by his eloquence in several notable cases. His ambition was no secret. He aspired to a seat in Parliament, and his name had lately been spoken with approval in influential circles." She lifted her eyes towards Holmes. "Yet, with all his promise, he was no reckless youth. He was devoted to his widowed mother, honourable in his dealings, and deeply beloved by those under his father's roof. When he failed to return upon the evening appointed, unease at first grew into alarm, and finally into despair. I, who have for years been governess to his cousins, could not shake the conviction that some misfortune, not voluntary absence, explained his disappearance." Her words, spoken with quiet earnestness, impressed me deeply, and I noted that Holmes's eyes, half closed, flickered once with keen interest at her description. Miss Fenwick's earnestness seemed only sharpened by the indignation that coloured her next words. "Alas, Mr. Holmes, the police have lent but little heed to our entreaties. The local inspector, after a most cursory examination, declared that Mr. Armitage had doubtless eloped with some secret attachment, as is the manner of young gentlemen with bright futures before them. He would not be persuaded, though we urged that Edward's character was far too steady for such folly. Indeed, he even smiled at my anxiety, remarking that ladies will ever conjure tragedies where none exist." Her cheeks flushed with anger at the recollection, and I confess I felt a pang of sympathy for her wounded pride. Holmes alone seemed unmoved, though his fingers drummed lightly upon the arm of his chair, a sure indication to me that his mind was already weaving the threads of this strange tapestry. "I have known Mr. Edward since he was a boy of 12, Miss Fenwick continued, with an almost maternal earnestness. "In all those years, I never once observed in him a levity of conduct that would justify such suspicions. His affections were open, his purposes clear, and he was loyal to the very core. When I beheld that hat, lying stained and deserted upon the earth, and the blood beside it, I felt, nay, I knew, that some calamity had overtaken him. No whisper of elopement, no fanciful invention of idle tongues can alter what my heart assures me is truth. Her voice faltered, yet she pressed on bravely. Others may choose to think me overwrought, but I have lived long in the Armitage household, and I have watched Edward grow into manhood. If ever a woman's instinct can be trusted, mine tells me he is in mortal peril. Holmes inclined his head gravely, the faintest glint in his eye betraying that her words had struck a chord within his own judgment. "You speak with conviction, madam," said Holmes at last. "Permit me a few inquiries, for often what seems trivial proves of greatest moment. When was Mr. Armitage last seen?" "On the evening before the hat was found. He dined with the family, then excused himself for a walk." "Alone?" She hesitated. "I cannot be certain. One of the footmen thought he saw him later near the stables, speaking in low tones to a stranger. The man was cloaked and turned quickly away. Strangers at night seldom herald benevolence," Holmes murmured. "And had Mr. Armitage enemies?" "None that I knew, save perhaps in his profession. He was lately engaged in a case concerning certain charges of corruption. He hinted more than once that his inquiries touched powerful interests, though he confided no details." Holmes' eyes brightened. "Indeed, that is a most suggestive point." He leaned back, fingers interlaced, his gaze fixed upon the fire as though reading therein some hidden cipher of fate. There followed a silence, broken only by the crackle of the flames and the faint rustle of Miss Fenwick's dress. At length Holmes rose, his decision made. "Your instincts are sound, madam," said he, with a bow of courtesy. "This affair bears the unmistakable stamp of design, and design of no ordinary sort. We shall accompany you to Kent and pursue them." Eyes half closed, and his long limbs stretched indolently. Yet I knew from the sharp contraction of his brows that his mind was busily weaving its invisible web. For myself, I could not resist the impression that we were passing from the familiar security of London into the shadow of some impending tragedy. The fields, blurred with mist, and the scattered cottages, dark against the pale horizon, only deepened the sense of foreboding which Clara's countenance betrayed. Not once did Holmes break his silence, until the train drew near Maidstone, when he remarked with sudden emphasis that, in such cases, Watson, the truth is generally found not in what is spoken openly, but in what is withheld. Thus prepared, we alighted, and soon the carriage conveyed us to the gates of Armitage Court. Armitage Court presented itself as one of those stately country houses which speak eloquently of England's older families. The facade, of mellowed stone, was adorned with ivy that clung tenaciously to the weathered walls, while tall chimneys rose against the sky like solemn sentinels. Yet, for all its grandeur, there was an air of gloom about the place, as though the spirit of prosperity had long since departed, leaving only pride and memory in its stead. Miss Fenwick, who had grown pale as we approached, whispered that she had never known the house to seem so desolate. Within the hall, we were received by a butler whose grave manner betrayed more than mere formality. He carried the weight of some hidden knowledge, and his eyes followed Clara with a mixture of pity and apprehension. As we waited in that vast chamber, its portraits of judges and soldiers staring down with stern countenances, I could not resist the impression that the very walls held their breath. Even before we encountered the family, one felt the oppressive atmosphere of secrecy, of grief concealed rather than expressed. Holmes, I noticed, cast a swift glance upward at those ancestral faces, before turning sharply as Sir George entered. The master of the house advanced with slow dignity, leaning upon a cane though his frame was still upright. Sir George Armitage bore the unmistakable aspect of authority, aquiline features, iron-grey hair, and eyes which seemed accustomed to command and to judge. Yet there was a rigidity in his expression, a tightening about the mouth, which suggested more than sternness. It was the mask of one who holds some inner citadel of thought, barred against intrusion. Holmes, with his usual ease, introduced himself and stated our purpose with clarity. Sir George listened in grave silence, then replied in measured tones that his son had chosen a life of ambition, and that such careers were ever fraught with risk. "I have faith," said he, "that Edward will return of his own accord when it suits him. In the meantime, I will not disturb the family's honour with idle rumours." "Honour, Sir George," Holmes remarked softly, "is best preserved by candour. You must forgive me if I observe that the law, though once your servant, cannot shield you from truth." The old man's eyes flashed momentarily, but he offered no rejoinder. His hand tightened upon the cane, and I marked the tremor which passed through his frame at the mention of the law. Holmes, with an inscrutable smile, allowed the silence to linger before bowing courteously. It was clear, even to my less discerning faculties, that beneath that judicial exterior there lay some burden too heavy for mere age to explain. We were next presented to Lady Armitage, whose fragile figure and wan complexion bore witness to sleepless nights and a heart ill at ease. She welcomed us with courtesy, yet her voice trembled and her eyes rarely met ours, flitting instead to Clara as though beseeching her for strength. Holmes, in his gentlest manner, inquired after her son. "I cannot speak of him without tears," she faltered. "He was ever dutiful, and his absence gnaws at me. Yet Sir George bids me hope, and I strive to obey." Her words, though simple, carried that accent of suppressed knowledge which Holmes never failed to detect. He asked whether Edward had spoken, detected a note of calculation in his manner, as though he were eager to assure us of his innocence before suspicion could arise. Holmes regarded him with that half-lidded gaze which I had come to know as the prelude to some shrewd appraisal. He listened attentively as Wilton explained that he had been a frequent visitor at the court, both on account of his friendship with Edward and of his long acquaintance with the family. "A house without its heir is a ship without its captain," he observed smoothly. Holmes merely inclined his head, but when the man's back was turned, he murmured to me, "Convenience, Watson, is oft the ally of falsehood. His presence here is explained too carefully. It would be folly to ignore him." Later, in the privacy of a small withdrawing room, Holmes once more took up the battered Deerstalker which Miss Fenwick had entrusted to him. With his magnifying lens he scrutinized the interior, his long fingers as delicate as those of a surgeon probing for a hidden lesion. "Observe here, Watson," he said at length, pointing to the lining. "A faint grey residue. Tobacco ash, but not of the ordinary sort. This is the product of an Eastern mixture, strong and rare, such as one encounters only among a select few habitués of the foreign clubs. Our missing barrister, by all accounts a temperate man, would scarcely have favoured such a blend. Therefore the hat is not his." He turned it inside out, and I saw him trace with his nail a series of worn stitches. And here, half effaced, a monogram, the letters G.A., if I am not mistaken. Such markings are often forgotten by their owners, but they speak more truth than any oath. I marvelled at the certainty with which he read these signs, but Holmes, replacing the hat, only observed, "This trifling object is the lodestone of the affair. Mark it well, Watson." Holmes, with that tactful ease which ever won him the confidences of the humbler folk, contrived before long to engage several of the household servants in conversation. We strolled with them about the stable yard and kitchen garden, affecting mere curiosity concerning the management of the estate. Yet beneath such common talk, Holmes adroitly turned the discourse toward their absent master. It was then that one of the grooms, lowering his voice, ventured to say that Mr. Edward had of late been observed walking abroad at unseemly hours. More than once he had met by the river a lady, closely veiled, whose presence excited much speculation among the staff. Some whispered of romance, others of secret business, but none could assert with certainty who the woman was. "Did Sir George know of this?" Holmes asked quietly. The man shook his head. "If he did, sir, he would have put an end to it, for he brooks no conduct that smacks of secrecy." Holmes thanked him with a nod and passed on. "To me," he whispered, "the servants see more than they understand, and they repeat more than they know. Yet even idle tongues may sometimes wag in the direction of truth." That night, when at last we found ourselves alone in the chamber assigned to us, I could restrain my curiosity no longer. "Surely, Holmes," I exclaimed, "the evidence points in many directions, yet none conclusive. I confess myself bewildered." Holmes, seated by the window, with his pipe sending thin spirals into the night air, regarded me with a half-smile. "You are not alone in your perplexity, my dear Watson. The case presents, indeed, more shadows than lights. But consider, a father evasive, a mother fearful, a rival too conveniently present, servants whispering of clandestine meetings, all bound together by a single battered hat whose ownership is already misrepresented. What does this tell us? That the household is steeped in concealment?" I ventured. "Precisely. Secrecy is the atmosphere of Armitage Court, and secrecy, Watson, is the very breeding ground of crime. Until we strip away these veils, we shall see nothing clearly. Yet I promise you, when the moment comes, the revelation shall be simple, terribly simple." His words, uttered with quiet conviction, left my arm. "You perceive it also, Watson?" "Yes," I whispered. "We are not alone." We continued our walk with apparent unconcern, yet the soft crunch of a stealthy step upon the gravel betrayed that we were indeed followed. Holmes led me by a circuitous path toward the river, then halted abruptly beneath the shelter of an oak. From that vantage we glimpsed a dark figure retreating hastily into the trees. "Note it well," Holmes murmured. "The watcher fears detection, yet will not desist. There is more here than filial disappearance, Watson. The threads are tightening." Later that evening, Miss Fenwick sought us in the withdrawing room, her countenance pale yet determined. With a glance toward the door to ensure we were alone, she spoke in a hurried undertone. "There is something I must tell you, Mr. Holmes, which I have not dared reveal to the family. For weeks before his disappearance, Mr. Edward received letters. Anonymous, threatening letters. I know this, for once, in his absence, a maid unwisely brought one to me, thinking it might be of domestic concern. The words were menacing, warning him to abandon certain inquiries into corruption, or pay dearly with his life." Holmes regarded her steadily. "And what did he do with them?" "He burned them all," she replied. "I saw him place one upon the fire, his face white with anger. He would never speak of it, but from that moment I feared he was in peril." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "Your instinct, madam, does you credit. It is precisely such trifles that form the cornerstones of truth." The following day, Holmes contrived to make inquiry among the villagers. It was in a small alehouse by the river that we encountered a weather-beaten boatman, whose memory, sharpened by Holmes's tactful prompting, yielded a fresh morsel of information. "Aye, sir," said the man, scratching his grey whiskers. I saw Mr. Armitage not 3 nights before he went missing. He came down to the riverbank after dusk, and with him was a lady. Leastwise, she wore a thick veil and spoke low, so I could scarce make out her voice. They walked together by the water, speaking in earnest, and then he pressed a paper into her hand. I rode past and they paid me no heed. "Could you describe her?" asked Holmes. "Only that she was tall, and her veil hid her face. But she moved with purpose, as one who carried weighty business." Holmes thanked the man, and as we stepped outside into the crisp air, I remarked upon the singularity of the meeting. "Indeed, Watson," said Holmes, his eyes brightening. "A veiled woman, secret conferences by the river, and threatening letters, all are separate notes, but played together, they form a theme." The more I pondered these disclosures, the more irresistibly my thoughts turned to Charles Wilton. He was Edward's rival at the bar, a man ambitious and smooth-tongued, whose frequent visits to the court seemed less the tribute of friendship than the assertion of opportunity. He had the ear of Sir George, who plainly favoured him, and his presence in the very midst of this family tragedy appeared to me altogether too fortunate to be innocent. In the long gallery, as we encountered him once more, I marked how his eyes lingered upon Clara with a familiarity that ill-suited the solemnity of our errand. When questioned lightly about Edward's disappearance, he replied with too ready an assurance, as though he had rehearsed the words. I recalled the threatening letters, the veiled woman, and the mysterious figure that dogged our steps at night, and all seemed to converge upon this man, who had most to gain from Edward's ruin. "Surely, Holmes," I exclaimed, when later we found ourselves alone, "the net is drawing round Wilton. Who else has the motive, the opportunity, and the audacity?" Holmes, however, only smiled that inscrutable smile of his, and made no reply, save to draw once upon his pipe and stare into the shadows. For my part, I grew impatient with his silence, yet long acquaintance had taught me that Holmes never withheld his judgment, save when he was certain the time was not ripe. He sat by the hearth that evening, his arm "Until the mask is lifted, let us not proclaim guilt." I bowed to his reasoning, though my heart still rebelled, for every instinct urged me toward Wilton. Yet Holmes' calm restraint, his refusal to be hurried into judgment, impressed upon me that the case was deepening into labyrinthine shadows. It was upon the following afternoon that the dreadful certainty descended upon the household. Acting upon information brought by a labourer, Holmes led us to a copse not half a mile from the gates of Armitage Court. The ground there had been disturbed, and, with the aid of spades, the men soon uncovered that which we had most dreaded to find. Beneath the damp earth lay the body of Edward Armitage. His features, though pale and rigid, still bore the noble cast which Miss Fenwick had described with such affection. But what froze my very blood was the sight of the battered deerstalker hat laid with cruel deliberation upon his chest, as though it were a grotesque epitaph of the crime. I heard Clara give a choking cry behind me, and even the stoutest of the men turned aside, unwilling to gaze longer upon so pitiful a spectacle. Holmes stood unmoving, his arms folded, his eyes fixed with terrible intensity upon the body, as if every line and stain upon it were a letter in some cipher, awaiting his translation. Thus was the mystery no longer one of disappearance, but of murder most foul, and the shadow that had hung over Armitage Court deepened into night. When the body was borne back to the house, the effect upon its inmates was such as I shall never forget. Miss Fenwick, at the first sight of the lifeless form, uttered a wild sob and fell insensible into the arms of a maid. Lady Armitage, her frail strength wholly spent, clung to the bier with an agony of weeping, which wrung the hearts of all who witnessed it. Sir George, however, remained curiously unmoved. He stood erect, leaning heavily upon his cane, his stern features scarcely altered, save for a deeper line upon his brow. No cry escaped him, no tear softened his eye. To me, his composure was almost inhuman, and I could not but marvel at the contrast between his stoicism and the grief of those around him. Holmes, observing him closely, made no remark, but I saw in his gaze the cold gleam of suspicion. It was plain that the tragedy had struck chords within the family more complex than mere sorrow. The local constable, a stout, florid fellow named Briggs, wasted little time in drawing his conclusions. Standing in the hall with the assembled household, he announced that the evidence admitted of but one interpretation. "Mr. Edward Armitage," said he, "has plainly fallen victim to foul play. And who more likely than Mr. Charles Wilton? Here is a man jealous of the deceased's rising fame, covetous of his inheritance, and frequently upon these premises. The hat upon the corpse, that clinches it. A token designed to point suspicion elsewhere, but to my mind it does the opposite. For who but Wilton had cause to disguise his act beneath so clumsy a stratagem?" Wilton, pale and indignant, protested vehemently, but the constable only wagged his head and muttered that the law must take its course. Clara, recovering her senses, cried out that Edward's friend could never be guilty, yet her words were drowned in the murmurs of assent which followed Briggs's confident pronouncement. I confess that, despite my affection for the man, a heavy doubt stole over me as I listened. The circumstantial net seemed to close inexorably around him. In truth, the constable's logic, though coarse, struck me with undeniable force. I turned it over in my mind as I walked with Holmes through the sombre corridors of the house. Here was a rival at the bar, present in the very midst of the family at the hour of calamity, his interest in Edward's downfall clear to all. What could be more natural than that he, inflamed by jealousy and ambition, should have sought to remove his competitor by stealth? "Holmes," I exclaimed, unable to repress my conviction. "It must be Wilton." Broken only by muffled sobs, Holmes and I sat together in the library. The fire burned low, casting long shadows upon the carved panels, while outside the wind moaned through the trees. "Watson," said Holmes at last, "did it not strike you as singular that the hat should be so prominently displayed upon the corpse? Murderers do not commonly pause to arrange symbols upon their victims unless they wish to tell a story. And when a story is told too plainly, it is generally false." I protested that the coincidence was too strong to ignore. "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "it is too strong to be true. If Wilton were the culprit, would he not rather have hidden all trace than left behind this grotesque emblem? No, Watson. The scene was staged. Our task is not to accept the tale, but to discover the author." He drew from his pocket a scrap of paper, stained with earth, which he had furtively secured at the grave. "Behold, this fragment bears the impression of writing, a note perhaps, torn in haste. Such trifles are the true witnesses." He leaned back, eyes half closed. "Rest assured, my friend, we are upon the threshold of revelation. The real hand that struck Edward Armitage has yet to betray itself, but it will, and soon." As he spoke, the firelight flickered across his austere features, and I felt the weight of my error pressing heavily upon me, even as admiration for his unshaken judgment grew within my breast. On the following morning, Holmes expressed a wish to revisit the dismal spot where Edward Armitage had been unearthed. We set forth in the chill dawn, the frost crunching beneath our boots, and the grey mist rising like a shroud over the fields. Holmes carried a lantern, though the light of day was sufficient, for he insisted that the subtler traces might reveal themselves only beneath a concentrated beam. Arriving at the shallow grave, he set to work with a deliberation that astonished the country folk who had gathered out of morbid curiosity. He moved the lantern in slow arcs over the ground, stooping again and again, his sharp eyes missing nothing. I confess that the melancholy air of the place oppressed me sorely, but my companion seemed invigorated, as though the very horror of the deed lent wings to his faculties. Once or twice he uttered a short exclamation, and I noted him secure in his pocket some minute object, invisible to my eyes. At last he straightened himself, his expression grave yet triumphant. "Watson," said he, "here lies not merely the victim of violence, but the page of a manuscript still to be read. The soil has not yet closed its lips upon the truth." Holmes directed my attention to a series of depressions in the softened earth surrounding the grave. "Observe," he said, "the double impression of heels, deep and parallel, as of a man standing firmly. Now here, the faint scuffle marks, yet no struggle followed. From this we may infer that the poor fellow was already unconscious when brought hither. A conscious man would have resisted, leaving chaos in his wake. I bent to study the markings, but to my eye they were no more than shapeless hollows. Holmes, however, traced with his cane the story they contained. 2 men carried him, one taller than the other. Their steps are unequal, yet united in purpose. The soil, still moist, retains their record. Such is the handwriting of crime, Watson, and it cannot be erased by mere denial. The notion that Edward had been borne, lifeless or stunned to his grave, chilled me to the marrow. Holmes's calm recital only deepened my sense of awe at his uncanny gift for conjuring the past from such trifles. Holmes next drew forth the Deerstalker, which he had brought with him from the house. "Here, Watson, lies our most eloquent witness," he remarked, holding it against the light. With a small forceps, he extracted from the lining several tiny strands of cloth, scarcely perceptible save to the trained eye. "These are no common fibres," said he, with suppressed excitement. "They are of the quality and weave peculiar to illuminated a scrap of parchment, crumpled and stained. With delicate care he retrieved it and smoothed it upon his knee. "See here, Watson," he said. "Though torn, the words are still legible." I bent closer, and by the uncertain light I read, "Corruption, payments received, evidence against, judge." The remainder was too smudged to decipher, yet even these fragments struck like a thunderbolt. "It is Edward's hand," Holmes continued. "He had evidently reduced to writing certain notes of his inquiries. This, I surmise, was torn from a larger document, perhaps in haste, perhaps in fear. But mark the word judge, and you will perceive that our young barrister had indeed laid his hand upon perilous secrets." The mist swirled about us as though the very air recoiled from so dark a revelation. I shuddered at the thought that Edward's earnest pursuit of justice had drawn him into the snares of those whose robes concealed corruption rather than defended virtue. Holmes placed the scrap carefully in his pocket-book. "This, Watson, is the key. With it we shall open the most stubborn of locks." That evening Holmes made known his intention of summoning the household, together with Mr. Wilton, to the library. "I shall present certain papers," said he, "which Edward Armitage, in his foresight, left behind. The test is simple. Let us see who quails before their shadow." The summons was obeyed with evident reluctance. Sir George entered with stern dignity, leaning heavily upon his cane. Lady Armitage followed, her eyes red from weeping. Clara, pale but resolute, clung to the edge of a chair. Wilton, defiant yet uneasy, stood somewhat apart, as though unwilling to be classed with the family. Holmes, with perfect composure, placed upon the table a folded sheet, weighted by a candlestick. "Gentlemen, ladies," he said, "I am about to read from notes penned by Edward Armitage shortly before his death. They concern matters of great delicacy, and I beg your silent attention." I took up a position behind the curtains at Holmes's direction, scarcely understanding his purpose, but resolved to act at a signal. The silence deepened, until the crackle of the fire seemed loud as thunder. All eyes were fixed upon the folded paper, as though it was some talisman of fate. Holmes began to read in slow, deliberate tones from the parchment we had found. The words, fragmentary though they were, struck with the force of accusation. Corruption, judge, betrayal. At once I perceived a stir among the company. Lady Armitage clasped her hands convulsively. Clara bowed her head in silent grief. But it was Sir George upon whom my gaze fastened, for a change, sudden and terrible, passed over his countenance. His lips drew back in a snarl, his cane rattled upon the floor, and the mask of austere composure was torn aside to reveal rage and dread in equal measure. Holmes, watching keenly, allowed the silence to prolong itself. Then, folding the parchment, he said quietly, "Enough. We have seen all that was needful." The household sat transfixed, for guilt had proclaimed itself without a word of confession. With a cry, half of fury, half of despair, Sir George sprang to his feet. His features, so long schooled to judicial gravity, were contorted beyond recognition. "Yes," he thundered, "it was I who struck him down. He would have ruined me, dragged my name through the mire for the sake of his blasted honour. What is a son against the labour of a lifetime, the esteem of the world, the respect of one's peers? He pried into affairs that were no concern of his, and for that he met the fate of all fools who challenge authority." Lady Armitage uttered a shriek and covered her face. Clara gave a sob of horror. Wilton stood aghast, as though the foundations of his world had been rent asunder. Holmes alone remained calm. "You have spoken, Sir George," said he. "The law you once served will now demand its reckoning. It is a bitter irony that the judge should plead before the bar of justice." The old man sank back into his chair, his strength spent, his head bowed. The silence which followed was more terrible than his outburst, for it sealed the ruin, though Sir George's wrath were but a storm beating against a rock. The spectacle was terrible to witness. Years of self-restraint and cultivated dignity fell away in an instant, revealing a soul consumed by rage and fear. His hands clenched upon the chairback, his lips working soundlessly before the words burst forth in a torrent that left no room for doubt. "It is true," he cried hoarsely. "True, and may the heavens strike me for it. That boy, my own son, would have dragged me to ruin. Years ago, in my youth, I stooped, yes, I confess it, to take a bribe in a matter that was swiftly buried. No man suspected, no whisper tainted my reputation, and in time I rose to honour. But Edward, prying, restless, and too righteous for his own good, found the trace. He confronted me with it, his eyes blazing as though he were the judge and I the criminal. Sir George's chest heaved as the memory overwhelmed him. He spoke of exposure, of duty to the law, of cleansing the stain from our family name. He would have ruined me, made me a byword, shattered the toil of a lifetime. And what is a man's honour, his station, if not the very breath he lives by? Lady Armitage moaned and hid her face, while Clara pressed her hands against her mouth to stifle a sob. The old man's words, wrung from him by anguish and wrath, reverberated through the hall like a sentence pronounced upon himself. Sir George's voice sank lower, though each syllable cut like steel. I struck him. In that instant of madness, when he would not yield, I felled him with the very cane that has so long supported me. He fell. Oh, God forgive me, and lay still. When I saw what I had done, the fiend within me whispered to make the deed serve another purpose. He pointed with a trembling hand toward the Deerstalker. That hat, long unused, lay in my chamber. I placed it upon his breast, thinking to cast suspicion upon Wilton, whose rivalry was known. The blood upon the road, the grave in the copse, each was contrived to tell a tale that was not the truth. Yet the truth, inexorable, has spoken at last. A shudder passed through the room, and no man dared break the silence that followed. It was Holmes who broke the spell, his voice quiet yet carrying the authority of certainty. "One word more, Sir George. You believed Edward unguarded in his pursuit of justice. But he was not so alone as you supposed. The woman by the river, whom gossip miscalled his lover, was in fact no paramour. She was an informant, a courageous soul who had furnished him with evidence of your past misdeeds. He met her in secret to protect her safety, not his honour." Sir George's head sank upon his chest, as if each revelation weighed him further into despair. Lady Armitage uttered a cry of disbelief, while Clara's pale face blanched still more at the thought of Edward's nobility, so cruelly extinguished. Holmes folded his arms. Thus the veil is lifted. The supposed scandal of love was but the shadow cast by a nobler light. At this, Clara could no longer contain herself. She flung herself to her knees, covering her face with her hands, and wept with a grief so bitter that it pierced me to the heart. "Betrayed! By his own father!" she sobbed. "Oh, Edward, so brave, so steadfast, and struck down by the hand that should have guarded you." Her cries filled the chamber, and even Lady Armitage wept openly, while Wilton stood stricken, his pride broken by the revelation. The sight was one of unutterable tragedy, and I confess that tears started unbidden to my own eyes. The constable, who until now had stood hesitating at the threshold, stepped forward at last, his face grave. "Sir George Armitage," said he, "I take you into custody for the murder of your son, Edward Armitage." The law deeply engaged with the drama so lately concluded. For my own part, the image of Edward Armitage's fate and of Sir George's downfall haunted me sorely, yet the calm of Baker Street seemed a healing balm. It was here, at last, that Holmes consented to lay bare the full chain of his reasoning. "My dear Watson," said Holmes, as he drew his pipe from its rack, "the entire fabric of this affair may be said to hang upon a single article of attire. The Deerstalker hat, which so many hastily assumed to be Edward's, was in truth nothing of the sort. It belonged, as I suspected from the outset, to Sir George himself. He had worn it in earlier days during his country pursuits, though it had long since fallen into disuse. Its sudden reappearance upon the breast of the murdered man was therefore the first discordant note I listened intently, marvelling that so commonplace an object could conceal so vital a truth. Holmes smiled faintly at my expression. It is ever the error of the unimaginative to dismiss trifles, while in trifles resides the essence of deduction. That hat spoke volumes to me. From the moment it was unwrapped in our chambers, Holmes leaned forward, his voice deliberate and grave. You will recall the curious placement of the hat upon Edward's chest. To most observers it seemed a clue, perhaps a token dropped inadvertently. Yet to me it proclaimed artifice. Murderers, Watson, do not customarily waste precious moments in arranging symbols, unless they would have us read a story of their choosing. This was no accident of chance, but a contrivance calculated to mislead. He tapped the ash from his pipe. Sir George, in the first frenzy of his crime, sought not only to dispose of his son's body, but to cast suspicion upon Wilton, whose rivalry was notorious. The hat, once his own, served as a mask behind which he hoped to hide his guilt. But a mask, however carefully assumed, may slip at the faintest pressure. It was my task to apply that pressure. Holmes drew from his pocketbook a small envelope, which he placed upon the table. "Within this packet," said he, "lie two of the smallest, yet most decisive witnesses ever presented in a court of truth. First, the fibres of judicial robes, drawn from the lining of the hat. They were unmistakable to my trained eye, for the weave is of a pattern peculiar to those garments worn upon the bench. Could Edward, a barrister yet unseated, possess such a robe? Clearly not. But Sir George, long accustomed to it, could not prevent some stray threads from betraying him. He opened the envelope further and showed a pinch of grey dust. "And this, Watson, is ash from an Eastern tobacco, rare and pungent." Edward was no smoker of such blends. Yet Sir George, as I learned from an attendant at his club, was partial to them in secret. Thus, two witnesses, the cloth and the ash, spoke in unison, pointing inexorably towards the judge whose honour was but a mask for corruption. Holmes next produced the hat itself, now worn and discoloured from much handling. Here, Watson, lies perhaps the most damning testimony of all. Beneath the frayed lining, I traced the faintest stitching of letters, G.A. They were half effaced, overlooked by all save the observant, yet they whispered the truth more eloquently than any confession. The hat, once worn proudly by Sir George in his days of sport, had become his unwitting betrayer. When Edward stumbled upon his father's past misdeeds, the old man turned that relic of earlier years into a weapon of misdirection. But the very article he employed to deceive became the instrument of his exposure. Such is the irony of crime, that guilt leaves its signature in the smallest of places. I could not but marvel anew at my companion's unerring eye, Holmes' intervention, yet her words were shadowed by sorrow. "Edward's memory," she penned, "will ever remain bright to those who loved him, though the house he came from lies in ruins. I go forth into the world bereft, yet with the knowledge that truth was served." Holmes read the letter in silence, then folded it carefully. "Tragedy, Watson," he murmured, "is often but the echo of pride." The storm of our Kentish adventure having passed, we found ourselves once more in the tranquillity of Baker Street. The lamps were lit, the curtains drawn close against the winter night, and a cheerful blaze glowed upon the hearth. Holmes sat in his accustomed chair, pipe in hand, his long figure thrown into sharp relief by the firelight, while I occupied the opposite seat, with a sense of repose such as I had not known for many days. Outside, the wheels of carriages rolled faintly over the frozen streets, but within, all was stillness, save for the soft crackle of the flames. The papers of the case lay in ordered piles upon the table, mute witnesses of a tragedy that had shaken even my companion's imperturbable calm. For myself, the peace of that evening only deepened the melancholy reflections which the affair had stirred within my soul. At length I spoke, unable longer to confine my thoughts. "Holmes," said I, "of all the dark cases we have encountered together, none has pressed so heavily upon my heart as this, that a father, one entrusted with the sacred duty of justice, should turn his hand against his own flesh and blood is a cruelty that passes comprehension. I confess that the image of Edward Armitage, so full of promise, struck down by him who should have cherished and defended him, will haunt me to my last days." Holmes regarded me silently, his eyes shaded beneath the thin veil of smoke from his pipe. I felt almost ashamed of my emotion, yet could not suppress it. "What is ambition?" I continued. "What is honour or worldly regard, that it should outweigh the bonds of nature and affection? Truly it is a mystery darker than any we have unravelled." Holmes removed his pipe from his lips and leaned forward, his gaze intent upon the fire. "You speak with the voice of compassion, Watson, and rightly so. Yet remember that the human heart is oft enslaved, not only by love, but by fear, fear of disgrace, fear of the world's censure. The weight of reputation, once assumed, grows heavier with every year, until it becomes as intolerable as the crown upon a monarch's brow. Many a king has been crushed beneath his diadem, and many a private man, though clothed not in ermine but in simple cloth, has been destroyed by the tyranny of his own renown." He paused, then continued more softly. "Sir George Armitage was such a man. His honour, built upon sand, became to him more precious than the life of his son. That is the irony and the tragedy. that what the world esteems as virtue may, when corrupted, become the very instrument of ruin. His words fell with the sombre cadence of a judgment, and I could not but feel that he spoke less as the detective and more as a moralist, reading from the book of human frailty. For some minutes thereafter, Holmes sat in thought, his chin resting upon his hand, the firelight glinting upon the austere planes of his face. At last he said, "There is a peril more insidious than open crime, Watson, and that is the poison of pride and secrecy. Pride blinds a man to the plain dictates of conscience, and secrecy gives it the soil wherein to grow. Together they form a mask, which even the wisest wear too long, until it cleaves to the flesh and becomes indistinguishable from the man himself." He knocked the ashes gently from his pipe. Had Sir George confessed his youthful error, or sought amendment, the burden might have been lifted. But secrecy demanded silence, and pride demanded vengeance upon the one who would have spoken truth. Thus the innocent perished, and the guilty was unmasked, only at the cost of his soul. Holmes relit his pipe, and the thin blue spire— "Now, dear listener, let me ask you, what do you think was Sir George Armitage's greatest mistake? His crime itself, or the desperate attempt to disguise it? Share your thoughts below. If you enjoyed this mystery, do leave a comment, subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes cases, and share the tale with friends who love a good puzzle. Until the next investigation, the shadows of Baker Street will await us.